join Betsy or Rochelle. I think Rochelle, Betsy made you a co-host, so
Yeah,
a lot of people that
thank you,
coming
Jay.
in. First of all, hi to everyone. Hi, good afternoon. I think that everyone knows for the most part that Montessori traditionally has not focused heavy on data, or at least that's kind of the mindset or the thought of Montessori schools. But one of the things that we have given a lot of consideration to, especially as a Montessori school that's in the public sector, and for us trying to grow additional schools and support other schools that are trying to come into the public space, is that one, we have to prove that the model is successful, right? And so we start with that, but we also know that families also want to be really confident in the fact that their children will be successful into adulthood. And so I can tell you that for Kimboko and I think most people call her Rochelle. I tend to call her Kimboko Batamwene, her middle name. Before we transition to administration, both of us taught in traditional spaces. Myself as a traditional teacher, Kimboko taught as a Montessori teacher, but inside of a traditional space, right? And both of those spaces were heavily focused on data. And so, due to that focus on data, kind of like increasing growth, achievement scores, we did a lot of menial tasks for students. And we did a lot of those menial tasks, as I see Kiboko smiling there. We did those menial tasks in the name of efficiency. And what I mean by that is we would have to do things like sharpening pencils, putting out textbooks, mini whiteboards, markers, erasers, all type of stuff. And for me personally, every classroom would start with what we called a I do, we do, or you do, where we gave a mini lesson. Then the students would do the work alongside with us to practice. And then we would kind of release them to be a little bit more independent. And any infringement on that per se, children would get, some type of demerit. And if they follow, children would then get some type of reward instead. And all of this was really kind of in service of increasing data within the district. If anyone has ever taught or, knows about kind of like district schools or traditional charter schools. But one of the things that I started to notice in the work was that year over year, um, schools in specific classrooms, they could never get over 10% gains. Um, and further, students, they could not necessarily do well in testing. And even if they did do well in testing, when it came to applying that learning to the real world, the majority would still fail pretty miserably, I would have to say. And so, for a lot of us that have transitioned into Montessori spaces, whether you be a teacher or a parent, that has led a lot of us to believe in the Montessori model. And I think that the power of Montessori within itself is that one, things are happening always in real life. Instead of teachers, observing to rules and efficiency, teachers are instead kind of observing for independence. They're observing for problem solving, things that we call like productive struggle, order, all of these different things. We talk a lot about executive functioning that deals again a lot with order. And that doesn't mean that testing ability isn't important for us. It just means that it's not paramount for us in the same way that a lot of us have come to think about it. Um, so, with that, we today we want to have a conversation about the data that your K students are receiving. We initially put together a deck, and we still have the deck, and we might actually show that deck. But after just thinking about it, what we believe was that you guys would rather just a conversation about the reading and the math data that you're actually seeing instead of the deck. And then after attending the first Fridays that the Brooklyn campus did earlier today, what we realized too is that parents just had a lot of questions about what they were actually seeing. in how they might better support. And so, um, Rochelle, if you don't mind just introing and kind of like keying up the two types of data from MAP and RAS, and then we'll just open it up for discussions about what you're actually seeing, and how we, think about it in service. And just real quick before you say that, Kimboko, the one thing I would also add is that Denise might join the call as well. And so Denise Miles is our Director of Student Support Services. Chris, Denise, and I are also really thinking a lot. Yeah, say hi, Chris. Chris is on the calls. Thinking really hard about what a data dashboard needs to look like for parents and how we can use that data to get out information to parents, whether on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis, so that you can have the information that you guys feel like you need in a very succinct fashion, so you understand a little bit more about what's going into the classrooms. And so as we think about this conversation today, Chris and I will be taking notes about some of the questions that you're asking, so that will help us, better gauge what you actually are looking for and how we might create that information in a way that is digestible for parents and get that information out to you more regularly. So,
okay. So I'll start just big picture with the kinds of data that we collect. In a traditional year, or actually I'll start with kindergartners. So kindergartners are the students who are going to have the most formal assessments. The kindergartners take something called NWEA MAP growth. It's a computer-based assessment, and you got a score report from that. For kindergarten, we are only offering the math. You all got to experience that with them. So you heard that it reads to them, and they get asked to answer questions that should be within what they've been taught in the classroom. They might be different representations of the things that they've learned in the classroom. In fact, almost definitely they are for Montessori. But can they apply what they understand about math to answer questions? For your kindergartners, and this is true at either campus, this is the first time that they're taking a computer-based assessment. So there's that added layer of difficulty of, knowing how to use a computer in the first place. When we're in person together, we would have had a little orientation session. They would have had some practice using the computer before that happened. They kind of have had that because they've been home with you, but that's the MAP assessment. And we will continue to do that. We'll do that again in the middle of the year and at the end of the year. And we use those scores to measure their growth. So always the emphasis is two questions. One is their achievement, like how are they doing compared to other students? And the goal is to get to 50%. So if you're looking at your child's numbers, know that 50% is the norm. So that's where kind of the average student is for this age. And then the other measure.
So, okay, go ahead. I'll wait till you
That's
finish.
okay. So when I think on your score report, it shows what their percentile is. And so if it's over.
That right? Was that right?
The percentile, yep, is based on based on, I'll talk a little bit more about why.
Yeah, because I was like, is it just like, how some features would just give you a pat on the back, and parents get all excited because when I read it, I was like, what?
Interestingly, so achievement is one thing, and then the other thing is growth. So we're going to see growth, hopefully.
Okay.
This benchmark in the middle, and then from this benchmark and the end of the year. For us, normally we would measure from spring of the following year to the following spring. This year, and for kindergartners, obviously from fall to spring because they don't have a spring score. This year, because we didn't, a couple things are going on with MAP, and we didn't complete our benchmark at the end of the year. I think, what did we do? We're going to do winter to winter, Chris? Yeah, so we'll do winter to winter for the older students. So for our students, that's not relevant, but just so you know, it's normally spring to spring.
Okay.
And so what's interesting about these scores, so yeah, the scores are high, and all of us who've seen MAP scores before for kindergartners are a little bit surprised by these scores. We're cautiously looking at them. What happened about 2 years ago, NWEA realized that they wanted to change their K2 test, which is what our students have taken. And they had a whole change plan. They tested it last year. And so what our kindergarten students have taken is a new K2 test. It's different from the one that the kids took in the spring. And it is true across both campuses that the kindergartners and many of the students even older than that have done better on that K2 test than they have historically at Lee. So we don't know whether, the question then is, if NWA made a better test, then maybe that means that our kids are, that's great. So that means our students are performing better in comparison to others than they have before, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's different questions that they got asked. Maybe it's a different way that the questions got asked. Whatever it is, we've noticed it too. And so it's fantastic. But what we're going to focus on is growth. So we'll focus on making sure that the children are making the projected growth. One thing to know about this new test is that because it's new, NWA doesn't really know yet. They have not yet figured out what the growth, I'll answer your question in a second, Jess. What the projected growth will be. They expect to release that in December. So by the time we do our middle of the year benchmark, we'll know what the growth projections are for the year. Jess, to your question, our students are being compared to students of the same age and about the same time frame, so same fall benchmark, who are all using MAP. So it's anyone who's using MAP. So we're not comparing to someone who's doing a different test, but just normed against students who are taking MAP of the same age and at the same benchmark. We want our students to be doing above the 50th percentile, because that means that they're where they should be, would be expected to be for their age and the time of the year. So that's MAP. Next year, when they're older, when we have first graders, we will add to that a MAP reading test. And the MAP reading test is similarly computer-based. For the younger students, the K2 students, it reads to them. So it is more of a test of reading comprehension and vocabulary and kind of language sense than it is of real explicit reading. I'm gonna let the questions roll and I'll come back to them. The thing that we use to measure reading fluency and kind of read aloud capability in face-to-face times would be a tool called the DRA, or the Developmental Reading Assessment. Because that really requires you to sit side by side with the child and watch their reading and be with them while they're reading. We are using something instead. We're using a tool called Reading A to Z, a product called RazKids. And so, the RazKids book levels don't directly correlate to the DRA levels. But one of the things that we can do is use a correlation. I can share the correlation chart with you. That could also be helpful for you if you are trying to choose books in RazKids, or if you're trying to choose books in EPIC or some other reading program that gives you levels. You can, the correlation chart that I just shared will help you connect your child's RazKids book level to those other tools. So, so that's a tool for you. And so the challenge of the RazKids thing, we realized as we were kind of in the midst of it that it had some technical limitations that we hadn't anticipated. So one of those is that some of the first pieces of the assessment test or of the placement test actually ask the child to read, and sometimes parents without even thinking helped them read so that they could answer the questions, right? So that was something that happened. But also just it was a really new experience for some of the children, and they didn't really demonstrate everything they knew. So we do have some book levels where the teachers looked at that and said, oh, you know what, let me actually ask them to read something for me or listen to them read in a recording, and they used that that recording or that live reading to verify the book level. So, and as we move forward and the children make progress, that will be how the teachers really know, yeah, we've actually moved to the next book level.
Yeah, because I think she went to the next book level, and
Mhm.
I think the words might be a little harder. So I don't know how to. I was trying to figure out how to break them down, like
Mhm.
anywhere or backyard.
Mhm.
It seemed in her, I can tell like it looked too big, but I tried to break it up.
Yeah. So one thing I will say, one of the things that we decided in the spring was to go ahead and use this program called HeadSprout. So it's part of the Learning A to Z is the company that owns Raz Kids. And HeadSprout is instructional. So it's like really straight teaching how to read. And it's starting with letter sounds, it's adding blends, it's adding phonograms.
Right.
It is not exactly the same sequence we would use in the classroom, but it is an instructional sequence, and it's adaptive to your child's performance. So one thing you could do to really support reading, kind of the reading instruction between when you're checking with, when they're having a one-on-one with their guide, is use HeadSprout. We have asked for about an hour a week on HeadSprout. And I do think that that really could help us, so that you're not in the business of, you're not having to teach reading, right? You can say, let's do 10 minutes of HeadSprout. And if you get an idea of what the HeadSprout episodes are asking her to do, then you can build on that. But you don't have to teach her to read, if that makes sense. I'm looking at Hallie and Allison and Leticia while I say that.
Yeah, because I was like,
you're-
I don't know. I want a teacher.
And if you want to, when you go, I'll find another link that I can send you that will show you what the episodes in HeadSprout are doing, so you can have an idea of what the pathway is.
Oh, we do it all, because I think Head Sprout is the one with the aliens, and
Mhm,
then they're going on an adventure, right?
mhm.
So like she went all through the water, and now she's doing something else. So
Yeah.
we're all on it. It's just I want to know some techniques, but I guess I'll just
Yeah.
have to.
Well, then that's it. I mean, I will say, I'll make a plug for office hours, because that's definitely a good.
I think I figured it out how to finally schedule an appointment with Miss Hallie. So I'm going to
So
talk
Ms.
with
Hallie
her.
can give you some tips on teaching reading.
Mhm.
Um, Tracy, to your question about objective indicators. So what we gave you was a family report, which really just gives you a score. What I can provide you if you want more, or Hallie, not Hallie, Amanda can give you as well, is there's a student report that shows the math, 4 dimensions, kind of 4 math dimensions, and shows her relative areas of strength that fold up to make that single score, that single RIT score. And in that report, you can also dig in even further if you want to see it, and see the Common Core standard correlation. So
Mhm.
it is based on um, Common Core standards. It's, in theory, MAP is very well, I mean, as well as any are. Maybe iReady claims to be a little bit better, but MAP is really aligned to Common Core standards. So if you were looking at the kindergarten standards, those are going to be the kinds of things that she's going to be asked in the test. You saw some of it, but it's going to ask her some that are more sophisticated, and some, and then decide whether, if she's answering correctly, both, it's adaptive. So if she's answering correctly, it is going to give her something that's that's on that level, or maybe just a little bit more challenging. So it'll go further in skills, but then the challenge is always, if you start slow, then you may not get offered some of the other things that you know how to do. We have another tool called Map Skills. Like if you are really convinced that there's something that the assessment didn't expose, that's a skill of hers, we could also do some Map Skills to drill down into something more specific. But that's not. But that's a kind of an additional thing that we would do if we were concerned about it. For the Ks at this point, it's we're not necessarily at that space with them.
Okay. I just wanted to like know what that number meant. So
Right,
Yeah,
that's what I
no,
was trying to get to. Like, that's what I was
I mean,
wondering.
what I can say about the RIT score is it is developmental. So if you look at the tables, I can.
Because it said it went from 100, I think, to 300, right? Something like that.
And so what happens is the kind of the older and the more skills you have, or kind of the deeper you understand the skills, the higher the score gets. And
Okay,
so those scores roughly correlate to grade levels, but the problem is that sometimes, like I wouldn't say necessarily, oh, they're scoring at a third grade level necessarily, but it might be that they have third grade understanding of certain math concepts, right? They've got a more sophisticated understanding of math concepts. So you can have some kids with some really high scores.
yeah, because hers was 175. Was that considered high?
They are, everybody in our group of 23 scored at or above the norm. So everybody did well. And this is my 4th year, I think, or is that right? I think it's my 4th year doing math, 3rd or 4th. And I've not ever seen that with the case. So that was.
Hold on real quick. Who is it?
Sorry. All right. So I think that is is that all that you wanted me to say, Alex? Maybe more?
No, I think that's perfect. I think the only thing that I would add is that Tomoko said that at the beginning, the scores were a little higher than we expected. What I would also say is we generally teach children, especially at the K level, because Montessori is not tech intensive. We would usually take time to help them learn how to navigate the mouse or the touch screen, how to drag and drop the tools, all those things. And children so far this year have been learning that since the beginning, right? And so they've had additional practice that children in previous years just would not have had. And so that probably has also led to, slightly higher scores than what we are normally used to, which is a good thing and should prepare them as they continue to move forward.
Yeah. What other questions do you guys have?
Rochelle, I have a question. Are children nationwide taking the MAP test, or is it limited to the local area?
Oh yeah, all over the country, all over the world, actually, not just in the US. So it is one, I don't know if, I know that it's very well used in the US. It's very commonly used among Montessori programs and public Montessori programs in particular. Even to the extent that I know that NCMPS had started and may have an ongoing conversation with them about doing norming across just Montessori programs. So there are enough Montessori schools using it that we want to compare to each other and see if our norms are different than the national norms. Yeah.
I think I missed this because I logged on late. Sorry about it if you're repeating yourself. Was there anything where they're breaking up the age of the students? So they're all in kindergarten and you have some with a birthday early in the school year and some later. Is there anything looking at where they are compared to kids that are maybe the same year and say month to see how they're tracking that way?
I don't think so. I'm trying to think, Chris, I don't think it does by age. I mean, we could probably do it, pencil and paper, like we could, or
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Like we track that, we have that data. I've never really looked at it personally. I don't know that anybody at Lee Montessori has.
right. Logically, that does make sense. If you're a year old, if you're almost a year older, it makes a lot of sense that you could be scoring higher.
Right. I mean, my child is on the younger end, but that's something that we're seeing. I mean, just observing some differences sometimes with him, and then kids that are almost a year older than him, that things may look very different for what they're able to do at what point.
We have a really technical way of talking about it. Like we have young Ks and older Ks, and we just know, I know that it is the young K, if you're a really young kindergartner, you're only a couple months older than the pre-K 4s, right? Than some of the pre-K 4 students. So it's, which is one of the things I love about the Montessori classroom, right? It is that you can have someone who is just a couple months older than someone who is theoretically in a younger cohort, and they can be doing the same work, because developmentally it makes sense for them to be doing the same work, even if, by virtue of a birth date, they ended up in a slightly older cohort. I do really appreciate about our classrooms that that which age group you are is less less the determiner of what you're working on and more your skills, right?
Yeah, Rochelle, Alex mentioned this earlier, but we think these tests are important. We think the data is important, but the most important thing for the data is to drive the teacher's instruction, right? And so in that regard, it's an indicator. And so we'll take this data into account, but it's far from the only indicator. And really it's the teacher's expert level knowledge of the child, of the curriculum, of the model, of developmental psychology, and all of those things that really roll together to try to inform what instruction looks like for each child.
Yeah, I was going to point out what Tracy just sent. So what Tracy just sent is a great way to get a sense of what's the difference between an AA book or an A book or a B book, because you can just open those up and take a look at them. These benchmark passages and books are the ones that the guides would be using with your child to set their specific reading level if they had a question about what was coming out of the placement test, or if they're trying to determine whether they've made progress, they'll use these passages and books to do that. Which is almost exactly like the DRA. So the nice thing about the benchmark books is that they are pretty much what we would do in person, because you're reading a book, you have a copy of the book, the child has a copy of the book, and you're making notes about how they're reading. And so that's what we would do in person. So it's a pretty close approximation to the DRA. The process anyway. I don't know what. Hallie, Leticia, Allison, anything you want to add?
I would just say that I'm very pleased with all of my students' performances on the map. And I've been impressed by their skill level when I'm on calls with them as well.
Mm-hmm. So you see an alignment between how they did on map and how they're doing in person. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
One thing I would just add about HeadSprout use and like the running record for the assignments, which HeadSprout and RazKids are like together under one platform, so you'll access them together even though we're kind of talking about them at these separate things, is when your child is doing HeadSprout or doing an assessment, knowing how to like encourage them and keep them on track, but not answering for them, because like Rochelle said, HeadSprout is adaptive, and if you guide them to the right answer, they're going to get placed into a higher level than they actually are, and then it's not very helpful. The same thing goes for like ST Math and stuff too, but and then if you're doing those benchmark assessments, the thing that Tracy sent, if your child is recording for their teacher, like let them fail. Like if they miss a word, let them miss the word. Like we want to see a lot of the time, if we're working with them, we might coach them through like, you know, let's sound out that word, let's try it again. But if you're doing an assessment, just like press record and let them do whatever they're doing, because we want to know what they can and cannot do, even though it can be hard to like watch them totally mess it up.
Yeah, it's hard to watch. It's hard to listen, right? To Jess's question about bringing about iReady scores, I think I think Allison, I would say that's your call. Do you want Atticus's scores from iReady? It's a different assessment.
Not particularly. I am working with Atticus as he is now, not Atticus as he was last year. So, and I'm very pleased with what he's doing now. So I don't know that it would help me.
Yeah, I was gonna. I mean, that she said what I was thinking. It is it is information, but it is also last year. So, and
he didn't take
iReady
it
and
last year. He took it like a week before he started at Lee, because
so that
he
was
started Lee last month.
Yeah.
So-
Does it? Well, let me ask you. Do you see a difference between iReady and MAP in terms of his performance?
So the iReady is one of the reasons I was happy to leave his school.
Hmm.
I did sit through some of the iReady. I did not see any of the MAP. I logged him in for MAP and then I walked upstairs. So I have no idea what happened with MAP. iReady was, I thought, well, some of the questions I did see with iReady were things like, which one of these is false, which I thought was a little bit intense for kindergarten.
Yeah.
And it seemed like they were testing his test taking abilities and not actually his knowledge of like 3 + 6 = 9. So that was what I found upsetting, because it in my mind, I very quickly saw how a teacher might teach to a test. With questions like, which one of these is false for kindergartners, instead of like, I just need to know whether or not he can add 3 and 6.
Right.
But like you said, some people see iReady as being a little more accurate than MAP. So I don't know if that would be at all helpful, because he took it like the week before coming to Lee. It's not from last year, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm my understanding, Alex is probably having the same. iReady is pretty tightly aligned to Park, and that kind of style of questioning. And so, yeah, it makes sense that they're asking them things that are prelude to being able to take a Park, even at the kindergarten level, which may or may not happen. Pre-Kers are, oh, sorry, this is what I should have talked about. Sorry. Thank you, Christian, for reminding me. So I would say, it sounds like Allison would take it if you would like to share it, but it is not going to necessarily influence what she's doing right now with Atticus. Pre-Ks did not get involved in testing. However, we did do benchmark progress monitoring with them. So in an in-person year, we would use a tool called Gold. I can't remember, Teaching Strategies. Yeah, Teaching Strategies Gold, which is an observational tool. We would use it for math, language, and social emotional learning. I think there might be one other dimension. And so the teacher would make observations of students' abilities. They would possibly sit down and do some interactive things with them just to check, but a lot of it is observational. And since we were not in person, we decided not to use Gold this year, but what we did instead was build a tool, an internal tool, that is a progress monitoring tool that asks a lot of the same questions. So if you'll remember, probably 2 weeks ago, Alex shared a single page thing that had categories and had kind of bullet points of what kinds of things we were looking at in each of the categories. So there was social emotional learning, there was executive function, there was handwriting and motor skills, then math, language. And so the guides did for every student, so including the pre-K3 and pre-K4 students, an assessment of where they were using that progress monitoring tool, and they'll use that tool to fill out your conference reports. So your progress reports that you will get will be based in large part on that work that the guides have already done. So we did a benchmark for the pre-K 3s and 4s, just not a on the computer test one. If your child is using HeadSprout or RazKids, then that book level is a real thing. And so your guide can still be paying attention to that progress. Similarly, if you're using STMath, your guide is going to be paying attention to the progress, to the reporting from STMath about what they're learning. But separate from that, what we're going to use this year is this internal benchmark tool. So they'll come back to it again at the middle and the end of the year. Is that helpful? Yeah, so they're paying attention, just not on a computer. Hi, Christian.
Well, I'm wondering, yeah, hey, Christian. I'm wondering if the academic team could speak to a little bit about how they might use the data with student interests to, teach whatever subject, right? Not necessarily increase the data, because I like Jess's question, and I think the way that I will respond to that question, Jess, is again, keeping in mind that Kimboko and I both, taught at district schools and charter schools for that matter, but in traditional spaces. And I touched on this a bit earlier, but in those spaces, the data really is paramount, and the test taking is paramount. And so what you do receive is a lot of teaching to the test in order for them to, ace it in whatever capacity. And around 2016, a group of teachers and fellows, I won't get into that all of that, but we started going around the district to look at the differences in teaching and the differences in learning. And what we found was that in the lowest performing schools, the teaching and the instruction was actually better than the higher performing schools. And the lower performing schools were using things like AdReady. The lower performing schools were actually using things like STMath as well. And that's no knock to STMath or iReady, because I'm an advocate for STMath especially, and I also do like iReady, depending on how it's used. But what we found is the schools, in this case, I'm going to use DCPS schools like Janney and Lafayette and a few of those other schools that were outperforming, they weren't using those. And when we measured the level of instruction that was happening from the teachers, we found that to be lower also, but the data was a lot higher when they were doing beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year testing. So then we had to start asking ourselves why. Shortly after that, around 2018, all of the metrics for coaching started to change to reflect ideas that were more Montessori, because again, what we noticed that was happening with children is that the learning wasn't being synthesized. I always struggle with that word. It wasn't coming together because there was no practical life, real life application to what was actually being learned in class. And again, they weren't learning the order that naturally comes along with Montessori instruction. And so I said all that to say, for a guide, Leticia or Hallie or Allison, Amanda, whatever the case may be, it is important that they're using the progress monitoring tools that Kimboko spoke to Ernest about, and you as well, but it's not as important as using that to figure out still what a child's interest is and teach within that interest, with the idea, because they have this 3-year kind of like rollover with students. It's not, 1 year, then you're off to another teacher. Every child is going to stay with Hallie or Leticia for 3 years. They have a lot more opportunity to cover grounds and build that in. So I'm just wondering if one of the guides could speak to how you might use the data to push your instruction, but not teach to the test, and why it's important for a parent to be able to look at, like if I start sending out the more kind of granular data to some of the parents, if they're looking at the subjects or standards, why you wouldn't necessarily teach to that, but by the end of the 3 years before they move into elementary, they would be successful. And I know that I was talking a lot, sorry.
I can give it a stab, and then Allison and Leticia, if you want to jump in, add in anything. Um, so we, like Alex said, like we have this 3-year cycle. We spend 3 years with a child, and that then also like continues in elementary. They'll get to repeat that again. So we're looking at children where they are developmentally, and we're looking at what do we want them to be, what do we want them to have, what skills do we want them to have when they go to elementary. So I'm not super worried about like on the 3rd day of October, did we cover this skill? You know, that's why if your kid is having a bad day or things are feeling really crazy right now, we might be like, oh, let's just not worry about it for today because we'll get to that next week. Well, we are looking sort of in a longer term thing, and we have a progression of materials that we follow, but we're really looking at what are the whole skills? What does your whole child need to be successful in elementary? And we do that through talking to elementary teachers. And that's why it's great we have Rochelle, because she can tell us like, oh, you need to work on this a little bit. And the elementary teachers also know like there's a lot of overlap. So a lot of the math materials that we use in the kindergarten year, like the stamp game, they also use that in elementary. So your child may be somewhere in that progression of learning, but the next person is going to be able to pick up right where they are. The other thing that we use a lot of the like progress monitoring and this data for is to check like, we did geometry shapes when they were 3, but you know, I see on this test that they've forgotten a bunch of those. Maybe we should go back and review those because we're not necessarily delivering content in the same order as the traditional tests might expect us to, but we are delivering it. And so it can be helpful for us to look at the data to be like, oh, we need to review that, or I'm not surprised they didn't get to that because we're going to do that in 6 months, but we will get there. Did that answer the question? And does anyone have anything else to add to that?
Okay, I can say something. During the first days of the school, when they move to elementary class, the children, they are going to have the opportunity to work with the teacher. As Hailey say, they review again, because I noticed that some school, they have the cards and counters just to review maybe the number 0 to 10, the tens bar, the tens, review the teens, the tens numbers. And in that moment, the teacher is going to notice, because, you know, after summertime, the children, maybe they are going to forget many things. Maybe in the data say, oh, your child knows something, maybe working with the stamp game, something like that. Is working with the thousands, but you know, they have the opportunity in the beginning to review and review again, just to be sure, until they get again in the working period, and you already know what they are going to be working during the maybe 3rd week. I don't know. Is almost the same that Hailey say, or maybe I confuse everyone. I don't know. You know, is you review the same lesson, the shapes, the numbers, the colors, because they forgot many things sometimes.
They definitely have.
Thank you, Rachel.
They definitely. No, I'm smiling because
you have the experience working with the elementary class.
You would say they've never seen a stamp game, or they've never, you know, like, what do you mean? You know how to do this. I know when you visited in the spring, you were doing this. What do you mean you don't know how to do it? Yeah. By fall, they've forgotten everything. But
yeah,
it comes back pretty quickly. I wanted to touch a little bit on Tracy's question. She and I have been talking offline. So she asked about dashboard. And so when Alex says dashboard, what we have been thinking about are identifying, you know, 4 or 5 metrics that that will let you know, give you a high level picture of your child's kind of participation. So it might be their last formal assessment, you know, benchmark scores, but it might also be attendance. It might be their usage of the platforms. It could be which pieces of what we're offering they're attending. So like, are there some children who are coming to read aloud in specials, but not coming to lessons, right? So knowing that, but what Tracy was thinking more about in her question was having a sense of what lessons have been maybe recently offered, right? And that is, it is not something that we were thinking of on that dashboard. It is something that we have. I think each year we get a little bit closer to being willing to do it. It is for many teachers, it's a little bit of it brings a little fear. I mean, I'll just be honest, because you know it's a lot of accountability when parents can see what lessons your children are getting, right, and or not getting, as the case might be. So I think our school culture is evolving, and we're having more conversations about how much of that information and in what way we want to share it. But it is super helpful to know that is something that helps you, because then you know at home, particularly since we're in distance learning, right? Like, at home what lessons are being done. And so you can support that learning. Yeah. I mean, we're trying to come close to that with the weekly, kind of like the weekly postings of what to expect from a lesson or follow up from a lesson, but it is not exactly the same thing. So thank you for the.
And I don't mean to add any work onto anyone, but it's just for me to conceptually see, like Brianna has this practice that we're doing, was just say adding and subtracting. It just helps me to know that I'll just use terminology, like she understands that a minus signs means taken away or something like that. Like those things just help me to make sure I'm saying things correctly when we're doing it at home. So I don't know what that would be exactly, but I know I don't want to teach our instructor in the incorrect way. So that's where that came from.
No, it's helpful to hear. And I think one thing that we might be able to offer that's already built into our record keeping system is that there are great lessons, not lessons, sorry. Well, yeah, there's like lesson summaries, like they describe materials and lessons, and those are things that we could share too. Like maybe we can download those and share them so that you know what the Stamp Game Edition lesson looks like or what the bank game lesson looks like.
So also a lot of the stuff like for the Stamp Game, all of that's on Seesaw. So if for the lessons where it really does matter, like what language you're using, because like with the Stamp Game, right, you do want to make sure you're doing it in the same way, because otherwise she's going to end up super confused and everyone's going to be frustrated, and nobody wants that. When your guide assigns that through Seesaw, for the ones where it really does matter, like the Stamp Game, some of the language works, some of the practical life and sensorial, actually, we've got some videos that will show you exactly how to do it. And that's the great thing about like our Montessori training. We all have a very similar training. So even though like the Stamp Game videos were actually done by a guide at Brookland, we all teach it the same way. And so we broke up all the lessons, figured out what do we need parents to know. And that's what like Seesaw is great for, is giving you information on that as well.
So maybe we just need to remind you that those are there.
And what would be great feedback for us is if you're like, okay, but there's not a Seesaw lesson for this thing, tell us that, and then we know we need to create one for you as well.
Yeah,
Did that help?
I think that's definitely helpful. I just ask Amanda a lot, but I think that might be something that maybe we could put on Seesaw, just like the language or I don't know what else we could use, but I just hate to be that person that asks additional questions if it could be helpful for other people too. So that's why I was thinking maybe a dashboard where we could share all that information, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I think
actually, I think I like what you're saying. I think I actually agree. I think one of the challenges is like I think I heard you use the word minus, for instance, right? Montessori guides, for the most part, aren't going to use that same language. They're not going to use division because they're building the conceptual knowledge through concrete instruction, right? whereas we would have learned in the abstract where we're using addition, subtraction, division, multiplication, all of those different terms. What I can tell you is a few years back, we did some Common Core mapping, right? And so for children that are in grades K and up, like we map, like for instance, if like you take the number rods, right? We can say that this is mapped to this standard that represents addition and subtraction. It can help students learn or solve for the unknown, which goes into algebra, because that's kind of like the depth by which we look at things, putting things together, taking things apart. So it'll map for you all of the materials that you'll see in a classroom, how those actually map to standards. Sometimes where we struggle is giving too much of that information too soon, because then what can happen is that a parent that's not familiar with the Montessori instruction will try to move the student far sooner than what they're ready for. And the guides that do have that information know how to move them along. And so what I would encourage, because as we would need to talk about this a little bit more as a team on what information is being given out, but maybe what could happen is that this information is being given out prior to a week's instruction, if we're going into something different now that we're on like a scope and sequence, right? And so I think that would be helpful, so okay, well, if Amanda's using this material this week, this is what it actually corresponds with. You can choose whether or not, I think, to use more abstract math language if you want, but I would say that we don't necessarily focus on that, because we see that kind of like it's something that goes towards teaching to this test. We just want them to be able to apply, and we know that through time they'll get that, especially as they go into their elementary years. But if you think that'd be helpful, I can share something with you to look at, and then we can kind of talk offline, and then I'll bring it back to the team and we'll talk about it a little bit further.
Thank you. That was helpful.
More questions? Perfect timing.
Yes, perfect timing. Got a couple more minutes left. If anyone has anything else. The silence is killing me. Chris, you want to end this out with a good joke, a good dad joke or something?
Why didn't the skeleton go to the party?
Why?
He had no body to go with him.
Oh man, that was actually pretty easy. I can't believe someone didn't come up with that.
With more notice, I can come up with a much